Sarah McAllister dropped to her knees in the creek mud and pressed her mouth to the foal's cold muzzle, breathing for a creature the whole valley had already buried in its head. Behind her, the men laughed. "Widow can't even save herself now she's kissing a corpse." She didn't turn around. She breathed again. Before we go on, if stories of grit and grace move you, subscribe and stay with me to the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I know just how far Sarah's story has traveled today. The foal was not breathing, and Sarah McAllister decided it would. She had her hands buried to the wrist in the cold slick of the creek bank, both palms flat against the little animal's ribs, pushing down and letting up, pushing down and letting up the way Daniel had shown her once with a drowned lamb 3 summers back. Her arms shook. Her knees had gone numb in the mud, and still she pushed. "Come on," she said low, so only the foal could hear it. "Come on now, you ain't done. You hear me? You ain't done." The creek behind her had shrunk to a thread of brown water, hardly enough to wet a boot, and that was the whole trouble of the summer, laid bare. A whole valley gone to dust and bone, and here she was fighting a losing fight over a scrap of horse that wasn't even hers. She bent and breathed into its nose again, warm air into a cold body. She felt the ribs under her hands and thought she would break them. They were so thin. So she gentled her push, and just when she was about to give up on the pushing and start the grieving, the foal coughed. It was the smallest sound in the world. A wet, rattling little cough, no bigger than a kitten's sneeze. But Sarah McAllister sat back on her heels in the mud and pressed both muddy hands to her own mouth and let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob. "There you are," she whispered. "There you are." That was when she heard the men. They were up on the rise, 4 of them, sitting their horses easy in the killing heat, and they had been watching her the whole time. She knew them all. That was the worst of it. Grown men she'd sat beside in church, men whose wives she'd carried preserves to, and not a one of them had climbed down to help. "Well, I'll be," said Harlan Boggs, thumbing his hat back. "Widow McAllister's taken up doctorin' now." "Doctorin' the dead," said another, and they laughed. Sarah didn't look up. She was working her coat off her shoulders, one sleeve at a time, keeping one muddy hand always on the foal. "Miss Sarah!" Harlan called down, and there was a false kindness in it that was worse than the laughing. "Miss Sarah, you're going to want to leave that thing be. That's a stray. Dropped by some passin' outfit, 'cause it couldn't keep up. It's dead weight. Been dead weight since it hit the ground." "It's breathin'," Sarah said. "For now." "It's breathin'," she said again, and wrapped her coat around the foal's shivering body and got her arms underneath it. Now a grown horse is a thing no woman lifts alone, and even a starved foal is 40-50 pounds of loose bone and wet hide that does not want to be lifted. Sarah got it half up and staggered and went down on one knee and up on the rise. The men laughed again, and one of them said plain, so she'd be sure to hear it. "That's about the size of it, boys. Widow's got 40 acres of dust, a dead husband, a banknote she can't pay, and now a dead colt. Reckon she collects things nobody wants." Something in Sarah went very still and very cold. She did not answer him. She had learned in the 18 months since they'd put Daniel in the ground that answering only fed them. She got her feet under her. She got the foal up against her chest, its long, useless legs dangling its head lolling against her shoulder. And she took one step toward home, and then another, and the whole valley watched a widow carry what everyone but her knew was a corpse. She made it maybe 30 feet before a rider peeled off from the group. She heard the hooves and braced for more of it. More mockery, or worse, one of them coming down to take the foal from her by force, just to prove they could. She turned the little animal heavy in her arms, her jaw set hard. But it wasn't one of them. The man who swung down off the horse in front of her was a stranger. Trail dust to the knees, a week of dark beard, a good hat gone soft with weather. He had the loose, easy way of a man who'd spent more of his life on a horse than off it, and he had eyes that went straight past her to the foal and stayed there. "Ma'am?" he said and touched his hat brim. Then quiet. "You're about to drop it." "I'm not," Sarah said. "You are. He was already stepping in, already sliding his forearms under the foal's chest, and haunches taking the weight so smooth she barely felt the pass of it. "Easy. I got him. I got him, ma'am. Where we going?" Sarah stared at him. Nobody had said we to her in a year and a half. "House is that way," she managed. "The gray one, past the dead cottonwood. Then that's where we're headed." Up on the rise, Harlan Boggs's voice curdled. "Calloway. Calloway, you leave off. You're supposed to be riding for Mr. Rourke by sundown." The stranger Calloway didn't so much as glance up. "Reckon Mr. Rourke can wait on a dyin' horse same as anybody." "It's dead already, you fool." "Then I'm wasting my own time, ain't I?" Calloway said easily. "And no skin off yours." And he started walking the foal cradled against his chest, and after one frozen second, Sarah walked beside him, and the men on the rise fell silent, because there is nothing so infuriating to a cruel man as a kindness he can't stop. And her kitchen had not been warm in 18 months, but it was warm now, because the first thing Wade Calloway did when he laid the foal down on the plank floor was tell her plain and certain, "He's cold to the core, ma'am. Cold kills faster than hunger. We need heat, and we need it now." So Sarah built the fire up high in the middle of a 100-degree summer day, until sweat ran down both their faces, and between them they wrapped the foal in every blanket she owned, and Wade knelt over it, working its stick-thin legs, rubbing warmth back into a body that had nearly quit. "You know horses," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Knew 'em before I knew people," Wade said. "Reckon I liked 'em better, too. People'll tell you a thing's worthless to keep from having to care about it." He didn't look up when he said it. His hands kept moving. Easier that way. For them. Sarah crouched on the other side of the foal. In the firelight, she could see it better now, a dark little colt near black, with a slash of white down its face, and one white sock, and even skeleton thin and half dead. There was something in the bones of it, in the set of the head, that she didn't have the words for. "They said it's a stray," she said. "Said some outfit dumped it." Wade Calloway went quiet. He picked up the foal's near foreleg, gentle as anything, and turned it, and ran his thumb over the hide of the shoulder, and Sarah watched his face change. Just a flicker. But she'd gotten good this last year at reading the small ways a person's face gave away what their mouth wouldn't say. "What?" she said. "What is it?" "Nothin', ma'am. Mr. Calloway?" She said it hard. "You brought a dead man's kindness into my house, and I'm grateful for it, but I've had a year and a half of people deciding what I'm strong enough to hear, so don't you start. What is it?" He looked at her a long moment. Then he set the leg down careful. "No outfit dumps a foal like this," he said. "Not by accident. This ain't range stock, ma'am. Look at the head on him. Look at the length of leg. Somebody bred this animal on purpose, out of something fine, and somebody paid dear to do it." He wiped his palm on his trousers slow. "A foal like this don't get left. A foal like this gets lost, or gets taken. There's a difference, and men lie about which." The fire popped. Outside, the hot wind moved across 40 acres of Sarah McAllister's dying land. "You're saying somebody wants it?" Sarah said slowly. "I'm saying," Wade said, "that a lot of grown men rode past a dying foal today and made real sure to call it worthless where you could hear 'em. And I've never in my life known a truly worthless thing to need that much tellin'." The foal lived through the night. Sarah did not sleep. She sat on the floor with the little animal's head in her lap, and when it shivered, she pulled it closer. And somewhere past midnight, when the fire had burned low and Wade Calloway had gone out to see to his own horse and hadn't come back, gone on to Rourke's, she figured, gone where the pay was, she talked to it the way she used to talk to Daniel in the dark. "Everybody told me not to marry a poor man," she said to the foal. "Told me Daniel McAllister had nothing but 40 acres and a good back. Told me I'd starve." Her hand moved on the coarse dark coat. "Told me the same when he passed. Sell the land, Sarah. Go back east, Sarah. You can't run a ranch alone, Sarah." She was quiet a moment. "I got real tired of being told." The foal's ear flicked at the sound of her voice. "They're gonna say I lost my mind over you," she said. "You know that whole valley's gonna say Widow McAllister's out here nursing a dead horse in her kitchen, 'cause the grief finally took her." A short, wet laugh. "Maybe it has, but I heard you cough. I felt your heart start back up under my hands, and I'm not real interested in what a man on a hill thinks about that." By dawn, the foal could hold its own head up. By full light, it had drunk weak and greedy from the improvised bottle she'd rigged from a jug and a strip of clean rag, and Sarah McAllister sat back against her kitchen wall, with tears running down her exhausted face for the first time since the funeral, and did not wipe them away. That was when the knock came at the door. Clayton Rourke did not knock like a man asking to come in. He knocked like a man announcing that he already had. Sarah opened the door, and he filled the whole frame of it, a big man well-fed in a hungry year, in a good coat that had never seen honest sweat, and behind him, 3 of his hands sat their horses in her dooryard, like the answer to a question nobody had asked. "Miss McAllister." He took off his hat, which was worse somehow than if he'd left it on. "I heard you had some trouble down by the creek yesterday. Come to see you were all right." "I'm fine, Mr. Rourke." "Course you are." His eyes were already past her into the house hunting. "Course you are. Only folks are talking. Say you brought a sick animal into your home. That true?" "It's true." "Miss McAllister." He said her name the way Harlan Boggs had, soft, sorry, condescending. The voice grown men use on women and children when they mean to move them somewhere they don't want to go. "That's no place for a foal a woman's kitchen. It's not sanitary, and it's not safe. Now I've got proper stables, proper hands who know their business. Why don't you let me take that poor creature off your hands? I'll see it's cared for, or—" A small pause. "Put out of its misery if it comes to that. Kinder that way. Kinder than watchin' it suffer in your parlor." And Sarah McAllister, who had not slept, who was bone-tired and red-eyed and running on the last of her nerve, looked up into that big, smooth face and saw the thing Wade Calloway had told her she'd see. She saw Clayton Rourke's eyes flick just once past her shoulder to the blanketed shape by her fire, and she saw him want it. It was gone in half a second. He was all sorrow again, all neighborly concern. But she'd caught it. That naked flash of a man looking at a thing he'd already decided was his. "No," Sarah said. Rourke blinked. "Beg pardon?" "I said no." She stepped forward instead of back a small thing, but she saw him register it and pulled the door a little closer behind her. "You rode past that foal yesterday, same as everyone, Mr. Rourke. Your man Boggs called it a corpse to my face. Nobody wanted that animal when it was dying in the mud. And now it's lived one night, and here you are on my step at first light in your good coat offering to take it off my hands out of kindness." She let that sit. Awful lot of trouble to go to over a worthless stray. The neighborly warmth drained out of Clayton Rourke's face like water out of a cracked trough. "Miss McAllister," he said, and his voice had gone flat and cold, and there was the real man under it now. "You want to be real careful. A woman alone on land she can't pay for in a dry year. That's a hard row. Friends are worth something in a row like that. So are enemies." "Are you my enemy, Mr. Rourke? I'm your neighbor," he said. "For now." He set his hat back on. "You think on that foal. I'll give you fair money more than fair, seeing as it's near dead. That's a generous offer to a woman in your position. You won't get another." "I don't need it. Everybody needs it, ma'am," Clayton Rourke said, and there was something in the way he said it that put a cold finger straight down Sarah's spine. "Everybody needs something. That's how the world works. I just have to find out what a person needs, and then I own 'em." He touched his hat. "Good mornin'." He turned and mounted up, and his 3 hands turned their horses with him, and Sarah stood in her own doorway and watched them ride off her dry, dying land. And only when they'd crested the rise and gone did she let her legs go and sit down hard on the step. "He wants it," she thought. "He knows what it is, and he wants it. And he lied to my face about it being worthless, which meant it wasn't, which meant the whole valley had ridden past a fortune yesterday and called it a corpse, and one of them at least had known better all along." The county man came at noon. Eli Bannister was a thin, apologetic sort, a foreman for the county who spent his days carrying bad news to people who couldn't do anything about it, and he did it the way a man handles a hot skillet, quick and eager to be shut of it. Miss McAllister. He wouldn't quite meet her eye. He held out a folded paper, the way you'd hold out something that might bite. I'm real sorry. I truly am. This ain't my doin'. Sarah took it. She read it. Her face did not change because she'd stopped letting her face change in front of these men a long time ago. But her hand tightened on the paper until the edge cut a white line into her thumb. 90 days, she said. 90 days on the back taxes, ma'am, or the land's forfeit to the county. I'm sorry. $62. Bannister shifted his weight. It's the drought. Half the valley's behind. It ain't just you. But you came to me first. Eli. Bannister's silence was its own answer. Rourke, Sarah said quietly. Rourke told you to come to me first. I don't, ma'am. I just carry the papers. You just carry the papers. She folded the notice back along its crease, slow and precise. $62 in 90 days, in the worst summer this valley's ever seen, when there's no water to grow a crop, nor grass to fatten a steer. And Clayton Rourke stood on that very step this morning, offering to buy the one thing I got that's worth anything. She looked up at Bannister, and something in her look made the county man take half a step back. Tell me something, Mr. Bannister. If a woman's got a fortune sleeping by her fire, and she don't know it, what's the fastest way to get it off her for pennies? Bannister said nothing. You put her in a corner. Sarah answered herself, where she's got to sell it to eat, where she's got 90 days and no water and a debt she can't make. She nodded slow, like a person fitting the last piece into a puzzle they didn't want to solve. Thank you, Mr. Bannister. You've been a real help. Ma'am, I truly am sorry. I know you are, Sarah said not unkindly. That's the sad part. Half the men in this valley are sorry, and it never once stopped a single one of them from doing the thing they were sorry for. She stepped back into her doorway. 90 days. I heard you. Good afternoon. She shut the door. She stood with her back against it. And for one long minute, Sarah McAllister let herself feel exactly how alone she was, a widow. A debt she couldn't pay, a valley that had turned its back, and a powerful man who'd already told her plain that he meant to break her down until she gave him the one thing she had. Then she pushed off the door and went and knelt by the fire and looked at the little dark foal that had lived 2 days it wasn't supposed to. Well, she said to it, looks like we need each other more'n I thought. Wade Calloway came back that evening. She heard the horse first and reached for Daniel's old shotgun by the door because she'd stopped assuming a rider meant anything good. But then she heard the low, easy voice, Ma'am, it's Calloway. Wade Calloway. Don't shoot me, I brought oats. And something in her chest that had been clenched all day came loose. He came in with a sack over his shoulder and set it down and looked at the foal, and then he smiled, slow and real, the first true smile she'd seen on a man's face in longer than she could count. Well, look at that, he said softly. Look at that. He's holding his head up. He drank this morning, Sarah said. Twice more since. You did that. Wade crouched by the foal. 2 days ago that animal was gone, ma'am. Truly gone. And you brought him back with your own breath and your own 2 hands, and no earthly reason to believe it'd work. He shook his head. I've known cattlemen with 20 years and a fortune in stock couldn't have done what you'd done on that creek bank. Sarah looked away because she was not used to being seen, and it undid her a little. You didn't ride for Rourke, she said, to have something to say. No, ma'am. Why not? Man like that pays steady. And I got nothing to pay you with. She said it plain because it was true, and because she was too tired for anything but the truth. Nothing at all, Mr. Calloway. I owe $62 I don't have, and I've got 90 days to find water that don't exist. If you're staying because you think there's money in it, I'd rather you knew now there ain't. Wade Calloway was quiet a moment. He turned his hat slow in his hands. Rourke offered me $40 a month, he said, to help him run a widow off her land. He looked up at her. "I've done a lot of hard things for pay, ma'am. Broke horses that broke men. Rode country'd kill you soon as look at you. But I never yet took money to stand behind a man like Clayton Rourke while he did to somebody what he means to do to you." He set the hat aside. "So, no. I reckon I'll stay a while, if you'll have me. And I don't want your money, ma'am, seein' as you ain't got any, and seein' as—" He stopped and started again plainer. "Seein' as I'd feel a fair sight worse ridin' off and readin' in 2 months that the widow lost her land than I would goin' hungry a while." The fire crackled between them. "That foal," Sarah said finally, because her voice wasn't steady enough for anything else. "You said somebody bred it on purpose, out of something fine." "I did. Rourke came this morning, offered me money for it, said it was worthless and near dead, and then he offered me money anyhow." She met his eyes. And when he looked at it by the fire for just a second, Mr. Calloway, he looked at it the way a hungry man looks at a full plate. Then he pretended he hadn't. Wade Calloway went very still. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure." He turned and looked at the foal a long, long time. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped low and careful, the way a man talks when he's just understood that a thing he thought was small is not small at all. "Then somebody didn't lose this foal, ma'am," Wade said. "Somebody lost track of it. And Clayton Rourke knows exactly whose it was and exactly what it's worth, and he means to have it before anybody else finds out." He looked at Sarah. "Which means you're not just holding a horse. You're holding the one card in this whole valley that man can't stand for you to keep." They named it that night. Or rather Sarah did, and Wade only listened. She'd built the fire back up, and the foal had struggled to its feet, swaying splay-legged, ridiculous and miraculous all at once, and stood there in the middle of her kitchen floor, breathing hard from the effort of just being upright. And the firelight had caught the dark red glints in its near-black coat and lit them up like something banked and waiting. "Ember," Sarah said. Wade looked at her. "Fire that everybody thinks has gone out," she said, not to him, quite to the foal, or maybe to herself, or maybe to the whole valley up on its rise where it couldn't hear her. "You rake the ashes back and there's a coal still burning down under. Still hot, still alive, just waiting on somebody to know it's there." She reached out slow and laid her palm flat on the little animal's neck, and it didn't shy from her, it leaned in. "Ember, Ember," Wade said quiet, like he was agreeing to something bigger than a name. Outside, past the window, the summer dark stretched a mile in every direction, over cracked ground and dying stock, and neighbors who slept easy in their certainty. Somewhere out there, Clayton Rourke was sitting up late doing his sums, working out the days and the debt, and the exact amount of pressure it takes to break a woman alone. Somewhere out there the whole valley was going to wake up tomorrow, still sure they'd been right to laugh. And in a small warm kitchen, on 40 dying acres, a widow the world had written off, stood with her hand on the neck of a foal the world had thrown away. And for the first time since they'd lowered Daniel into the ground, she felt something in her that was not grief and was not fear. It felt, she thought, an awful lot like the start of a fight. "They threw you away," she told the foal very soft, "'cause they didn't know how to see you yet." The fire burned, the foal breathed, and Wade Calloway watched the two of them across the low flames and thought, though he did not say it, not that night, that Clayton Rourke had made the single worst mistake of his life the moment he'd decided a McAllister could be broke. Sarah McAllister had already been broken once all the way down to nothing, and a thing that's been broken all the way down and stood back up on its own, that is the one kind of thing in this world that cannot be broken twice. The morning after they named him Ember fell down and couldn't get back up, and Sarah McAllister thought she'd lost him after all. She was on her knees in the straw before she'd even finished screaming for Wade. Both hands under the foal's neck, and the little animal's eyes were rolled white, and his legs were kicking weak and useless against the plank floor. "Wade! Wade!" He came through the door, still pulling his suspenders up over one shoulder, and he was down beside her, in a breath running his hands along Ember's flank, his jaw. Then he stopped. He pressed 2 fingers up under the foal's lip. "He's not dying," Wade said. "He's on the floor, he can't. He's hungry, ma'am." Wade sat back. "That's all this is. His body's trying to grow faster than what you can feed him with a jug and a rag. He used up everything you gave him yesterday just standing up and naming himself, and now the well's dry." He looked at her, and there was something almost gentle underneath the plainness of it. "He didn't fall 'cause he's weak, Miss McAllister. He fell 'cause he's growing. Those are two different things, and you'd best learn to tell 'em apart, 'cause you're gonna feel your heart stop about 40 more times before this is over." Sarah pressed her hand flat to Ember's chest, and felt the heart going fast and strong, and let out a breath that shook the whole way out of her. "Then feed him," she said. "What's he need?" "Real milk. Mare's milk or near as we can get. That jug mix'll keep a foal alive a day or two, but it won't grow one." Wade got to his feet. "He needs a nurse mare, ma'am, or he needs a milk cow with something left in her, and I'd bet my saddle you don't have either. I got a cow." Sarah was already standing. "Daisy. She's old, and she's dry as everything else in this valley, but she calved in the spring, and I dried her off myself. I might—" She was moving before she finished the sentence. "There might be something left. There might be." There was not much, but there was some. And Sarah McAllister spent that morning coaxing a few thin cups of milk out of an old cow who had nothing to spare, and warming it and feeding it to a foal who drank like he'd been starving his whole short life, which Wade reminded her quiet. He had. "Somebody bred an animal like this," Wade said, watching Ember nurse Greedy at the rag, "and then let him get to this, half-starved, dumped in a creek." He shook his head slow. "You don't do that to something valuable by accident, ma'am. Somebody made real sure this foal was near dead before he ever hit that mud. That's not carelessness. That's intent." Sarah looked up sharp. "You think somebody tried to kill him? I think somebody tried to disappear him," Wade said. "And there's a difference, and I don't know yet which is worse." The rumors started before the week was out. It was the Wexler girl who brought the first of it, a skinny thing of maybe 14 who came by to trade eggs and stood in the dooryard, shifting foot to foot until Sarah asked her what was wrong. "My ma says I'm not to trade with you no more," the girl blurted. "She says," and here the child's face went red, "she says you've gone touched Miss McAllister, sleepin' in the barn with a dead horse. She says grief does that. She says I'm not to catch it." Sarah stood very still with the egg basket in her hands. "You can catch grief now, can you?" she said. "I don't," she just said. "You tell your ma," Sarah said, and her voice was even, which was worse than if it had shook, "that the horse ain't dead, and the widow ain't touched, and the eggs were fine." She set 2 coins in the girl's palm and folded her fingers over them. "And you come back any time you like, Ruby Wexler. I don't hold a child accountable for her mother's mouth." The girl fled, and Sarah stood in the yard a long moment before she went back inside, and Wade, who'd heard the whole thing through the open door, said nothing, only handed her the warm cup of milk for Ember, without being asked, which was its own kind of saying something. But it didn't stop with the Wexlers. By the next Sunday, Sarah McAllister had gone in the mouths of the valley from a poor widow to a mad one. She heard the shape of it come back to her in pieces from Bannister when he rode past from a peddler from the storekeeper in town, who wouldn't meet her eye when she came in for salt. She'd stopped going to church, they said. She talked to the animal like it was her dead husband, they said. She'd spent her last dollar on milk for a corpse, while her own land went to the county, they said. And wasn't it a shame? Wasn't it just a sorrow, what the loneliness had done to Daniel McAllister's widow? "They've decided," she told Wade one evening flat, watching Ember bigger, now steadier, butting his velvet nose against her arm for the milk. "They've all just decided what I am. And now every single thing I do, they'll bend it to fit. That's how it works," Wade said. "You feed a foal, you're touched. You keep your land, you're stubborn. You stand up straight, you're proud." He shook his head. "There's no move you can make that a made-up mind won't turn against you, ma'am. So you might as well quit trying to make the right one for them, and just make the right one." "And what's the right one?" Wade looked at Ember growing strong in the firelight, and then back at her. "Keep the horse alive," he said. "Everything else is noise." Clayton Rourke let 2 weeks go by. He was a patient man, and patience, Sarah was learning, was a weapon in the hands of the man who could afford to use it. He let the rumors do his early work. He let the heat build and the water shrink, and the 90 days start ticking down. And then when he judged her softened, he came again, not himself this time, but through his men in a way that was somehow worse. It started with the water. Sarah's 40 acres drew off a creek that ran down out of the high ground through Rourke's spread first, then hers, then on to the smaller places below. In a wet year, there was more than enough for everybody. In this year, there was barely enough for one. And one morning, Sarah walked down to her stretch of the creek to water the cow, and found it dry, not low dry, the mud already cracking, and her few head of stock standing at the empty bank bawling. She walked the creek up toward the high ground, and she found where it went. Rourke had dammed it. A crude thing of logs and packed earth thrown up right at his lower fence line, pooling every drop of the failing creek into his own land, letting nothing past. Two of his hands were leaning on the dam when she came up on it easy, like they'd been waiting. "Mornin', Miss McAllister," one of them said and grinned. "Something the matter? You've dammed the creek. Mr. Rourke's protecting his water rights, ma'am. Man's got a right to the water on his own land. It runs through his land to mine. It always has. You can't just—" "He can, though," the man said, still grinning. "That's the thing about a dry year, Miss McAllister. All them handshake arrangements folks live by in the good times they don't hold when the water gets low. Then it's just whoever's got the high ground and the men to hold it." He spat. "And that ain't you." Sarah stood there with her fists closed at her sides, and every cruel thing that had been said about her, every rumor and every turned back, seemed to pool in that dry, cracked creek bed, and for one white second she wanted to climb that dam and tear it apart with her bare hands. She didn't. She turned and walked home, and her legs were shaking, but not from fear. "He dammed the creek," she told Wade. Wade set down the halter he'd been mending. "He what?" "Dammed it clean off, right at his fence. My stock's got no water, Wade. The cow's got no water, and if the cow's got no water, she's got no milk, and if she's got no milk—" Her voice cracked for the first time right there, and she hated it, and she stopped and made herself finish steady. "If she's got no milk, Ember starves. That's the play. He dries me up so the horse dies natural, and then it's nobody's fault, and there's nobody to argue whose foal it was. And he never has to buy a thing off me at all. He just waits." Wade stood there a long moment, and then he did something Sarah didn't expect. He laughed short hard without any humor in it. "That," he said, "is the first genuinely stupid thing I've heard Clayton Rourke do. Stupid, he's got me by the throat. He's got you by the throat where everybody can see." Wade was already reaching for his hat. "Damming a creek in a drought and cutting off every small place below him. You think it's just you he dried up this morning? That creek feeds the Wexlers, feeds old man Pruitt, feeds 4 or 5 families below you that were already half-starved before Rourke decided the water was his. He didn't just make an enemy of the mad widow ma'am." He settled the hat on his head. "He made an enemy of every small rancher in this valley at the exact same time. And desperate men who all got the same enemy have a way of remembering they've got each other." But the water couldn't wait on Wade's theory, and Ember couldn't wait on the valley to find its spine. That night, the cow gave barely half a cup, and Ember drank it in 3 swallows, and shoved his nose against the empty jug, and cried a thin, desperate whicker that Sarah felt in her own chest like a hook. "I know," she whispered to him, both hands framing his face. "I know, baby, I know." She barely slept. And in the black hours before dawn, she made a decision that she knew was reckless, and made it anyway because reckless and dead were the only 2 roads left, and at least reckless had a fork in it. She woke Wade before light. "There's an old well," she said. "Up on the north corner. Daniel's daddy dug it 40 years back, and it went bad water came up bitter. No good for the house, no good for crops. We capped it and forgot it. But bitter water's still water, Wade. Stock'll drink it. And it's on my land above Rourke's dam where he can't touch it." Wade came awake fast. "How deep?" "Deep. And the cap's rotted and half-caved. It'd be a day's work at least to open it, maybe 2. And there's no promise. It's even still." "Then we start now," Wade said, and was already pulling his boots on. They dug from first light, and this is the part the valley would never have believed If they'd seen it, the mad widow and the drifter who wouldn't take Rourke's money, stripped down to shirt sleeves, in the killing heat, hauling rotted timber and caved earth out of an old well hole, hand over hand, while a half-grown foal stood at the fence and watched them like he understood exactly what they were doing. They hit the old cap by noon. They broke through it by mid-afternoon. And when Wade lowered a bucket down into the dark on a fraying rope, and it came up heavy, he hauled it over the lip and set it down, and they both stared at it. Water. Cloudy, faintly bitter smelling of iron and earth, but water. Sarah made a sound she didn't plan to make and pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth. Wade dipped 2 fingers, tasted, it made a face. "Bitter's right," he said. "You wouldn't want it in your coffee." Then he grinned, sweat-streaked and filthy and grinning like a boy. "But the cow'll drink it, and the cow'll make milk, and that horse—" He nodded at the fence where Ember stood watching. "That horse is gonna live another week that Clayton Rourke was counting on him to be dead." Sarah laughed, and it turned into something wetter halfway through, and she scooped a handful of the bitter water and let it run through her fingers like it was the finest thing she'd ever held. "He dammed the whole creek," she said, half wild with the relief of it, "and forgot there was water sittin' right under my own North 40 the whole time. Men like Rourke always forget," Wade said, "that the ground'll keep a secret from 'em. They're so busy looking at what's on top the fences, the herds, the water they can see and take, they never once think about what's under, what's been there all along, waitin'." He looked at her when he said it, and Sarah had the sudden strong feeling he wasn't only talking about the well. The bitter water saved them for a while. The cow drank and freshened, and gave enough that Ember stopped falling down. He grew that fortnight like the whole valley was pushing against him, and he'd decided to grow anyway out of spite. By the end of the month, he was up past Sarah's shoulder, all legs and appetite, and a dark near-black coat that had started in the good light to throw those red ember glints Wade swore he'd never seen on a horse before. And that was when old Tom Whitaker rode onto the place and everything changed. Sarah didn't know him. Wade did. "That's Tom Whitaker," Wade said, going still at the sight of the old man picking his way up the track on a fat gray mare. "German fella. Bred horses back east, for he came out and back in the old country before that. Best eye for a bloodline in 500 miles and the meanest tongue. If Tom Whitaker rides 2 hours out in this heat to look at something, ma'am, it ain't to be neighborly. Somebody told him something." The old man drew up in the yard, looked down his long nose at the two of them, and then he saw Ember at the fence, and Sarah watched Tom Whitaker's whole face do something. He got down off the mare without a word. He walked to the fence like a man in church. He stood there looking at the foal for a full minute, and then 2. And Ember, who shied from strangers, stood still and let the old man look, and something passed between the two of them that Sarah couldn't name. "Where," said Tom Whitaker finally in a thick accent, still not turning around, "did this animal come from?" "Found him in the creek," Sarah said, "half dead. Everybody said he was a worthless stray." Old Tom Whitaker laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has just heard something so stupid he can hardly credit it. "Worthless," he repeated. He turned around and his old eyes were bright and hard. "Worthless. Do you know what you are looking at, woman? He's a fine colt. Wade says his lines are, 'He is a catastrophe,'" Tom Whitaker said. "For somebody, somewhere. He is a catastrophe walking around on 4 legs in a widow's dooryard." He came away from the fence and got right up close to Sarah, close enough that Wade shifted forward half a step, and the old man jabbed a finger back at Ember without looking. "That coat, that head, the way he carries the tail. I have seen maybe 3 horses in 40 years carry themselves so, and every one of them cost more than this whole valley is worth, and every one of them belonged to men who do not lose foals. You understand me? Men who do not lose foals." His voice dropped. "So either you have stolen a fortune, Frau McAllister, or somebody has, and left it dying in your creek to be rid of the evidence." Sarah's blood went cold. "I didn't steal anything. I found him." "I believe you," Tom said. "You are too poor and too honest to have done it clever, and this was done clever. Somebody wanted this foal gone and gone in a way nobody would ever look at again. A dead stray in a dry creek. Who counts those? He shook his head. But he didn't die, because you would not let him. And now, the old man's eyes narrowed. Now there is a fortune walking around where it is not supposed to be. And somewhere, Frau McAllister, there is a man who thinks this problem is already solved, who thinks it is buried. Clayton Rourke, Wade said low. Old Tom's head turned. Rourke, the big one, with the water and the county in his pocket. He was quiet a moment. Yeah, that would make sense. A man like that does not laugh at a foal in a creek unless he already knows exactly what it is worth. He looked back at Sarah, and for the first time, something almost like respect crept into the hard old face. You have a tiger by the tail, woman, and you did not even know you had caught it. Yeah. That night, Sarah couldn't eat. She sat at her own table, with her hands wrapped around a cup of the bitter well water gone cold, and Wade sat across from her. And Ember dozed by the fire, too big for it now, really, but neither of them had the heart to put him out. And the thing old Tom had said sat in the middle of the room like a loaded gun. Somebody made him disappear, she said finally. That's what you both keep circling. Somebody with money and reach took a foal worth more than my whole life, and instead of selling it or keeping it, they tried to make it vanish. She looked up at Wade. Why? Why would a man throw away a fortune? Only one reason I know of, Wade said slow. You throw away a fortune when keeping it would cost you more than the fortune's worth. When that foal being alive, being found, being known is worse for you than losing all that money. He turned his cup in his hands. A horse like that's got papers, ma'am. A bloodline. A name in a book somewhere. And a bloodline can prove things. Whose it is. Where it came from. Who bred it and who paid and who was owed. He met her eyes. Ember ain't just worth money, Miss McAllister. He's evidence. And evidence is the one kind of fortune a guilty man'll pay any price to bury. The fire popped. Ember's ear flicked in his sleep. Evidence of what? Sarah whispered. I don't know yet, Wade said. But I aim to find out. And I'll tell you what I do know. The second Clayton Rourke learns that foal's still breathin'. And gettin' famous, learns Tom Whitaker rode out here and stood at your fence like it was a shrine. He is not going to wait on the water and the taxes to do his work slow anymore. He set the cup down. He's going to come do it fast. He was right, but not the way either of them expected. It was 3 days later, in the dead heat of an afternoon, that Sarah heard the riders. And this time it wasn't two of Rourke's hands come to smirk at the dam. It was 6 of them, and Rourke himself out front, and they came up the track fast and reined in hard in a cloud of hot dust. And Sarah came out onto her step with Daniel's shotgun in her hands, and Wade came around the corner of the barn with his own hand near his hip, and Ember in the near paddock threw his head up and pinned his ears. Miss McAllister. Rourke didn't get down this time. He sat his horse and looked down at her, and there was no false kindness left in him at all now. I've come to make you a last offer, and I want you to hear the word last. You've dried up my creek, Mr. Rourke, Sarah said. You've put the county on me. You've turned this whole valley against me with lies. I don't reckon there's much you can offer that I want. $200, Rourke said. The number hung in the hot air. It was more than 3 times what she owed the county. It was more money than Sarah McAllister had seen in one place in her whole life. For the foal, Rourke said. $200 cash in your hand today, and I'll lift the dam and speak to the county about your taxes besides. You walk away clear. You walk away rich for a woman in your spot. He leaned forward on the saddle horn. You'd be a fool past savin' to say no. Even a mad widow can count. And here is the thing that told Sarah everything. $200. For a foal he'd called a corpse 3 weeks back. For a worthless stray. For a dead animal not worth the trouble of watering. Clayton Rourke, who never spent a dollar he could keep, was sitting on her step offering her a fortune and a clean escape from every trap he'd built just to get his hands on a horse he'd sworn wasn't worth the mud it was born in. Sarah looked at that number in his eyes, and then she looked past him at Ember standing in the paddock with his ears pinned and his head high, and the late sun catching the red in his black coat. And she understood all the way down exactly how afraid Clayton Rourke was. "No," she said. Rourke's face didn't move. 300. "No. I'm offering you your whole life back, woman. You're offering me $300 for a horse you told the entire valley was worthless," Sarah said, and her voice carried clear and hard across the yard to every one of his men. 3 weeks ago, you rode past that foal dying in the mud and let your man call him a corpse to my face. And now you'll pay $300 for him and lift the dam and square my taxes and let me walk away rich." She took one step down off her porch shotgun, cradled easy, and she was smiling, and it was not a nice smile. "You must be awful scared of a corpse, Mr. Rourke." Something went across Clayton Rourke's face then that Sarah had never seen on it before, and it took her a second to name it, because she'd never once imagined she'd have cause to see it there. Fear. Naked fear. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was worse, because it was cold, and it was final, and it was a man who had just decided he'd wasted his last dollar on a fool. "All right," Rourke said quietly. He straightened in the saddle. "All right then, I made you a fair offer, made you 3 of them. The whole valley heard me offer to save your land and heard you spit on it." He gathered his reins. "So when you lose it, and you will lose it, Miss McAllister, inside of 2 months, there won't be a soul in this county'll say Clayton Rourke didn't try to help the poor mad widow. They'll say she was too crazy to be helped." He touched his hat with terrible politeness. "That's how it'll be remembered. You've seen to that yourself." "Get off my land," Sarah said. "Gladly." He turned his horse. Then he paused and half turned back, and for the first time he looked past her right at Ember, standing furious in the paddock, and something flickered in his eyes that was almost hunger and almost hate. "That animal," Rourke said softly, "is going to cost you everything you have left in this world. And you still won't understand why. That's the part I almost feel sorry for. You'll lose it all, and you'll never even know what it was you were dying for." He rode off. His 6 men wheeled and followed, and Sarah McAllister stood in her dooryard with the shotgun going heavy in her hands and watched them go. And only when the dust had settled did she realize she was shaking. Not with fear this time, but with the awful electric knowledge that she had just very deliberately slammed a door on the only easy way out she was ever going to be offered. $300, Wade said quietly, coming up beside her. "You had $300 in your hand, ma'am, and your land clear, and you told him to get off your grass." "I know." "You know what he'll do now." "I know what he'll do now." Sarah watched the last of the dust settle over Rourke's dam in the distance. "He offered me money 'cause money was cheaper than the truth. And I said no. So now he's got no choice but to make the truth disappear another way." She turned and looked at Wade, and her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "He's not going to try to buy Ember anymore, Wade. You don't buy a thing you can just take. He's going to come take him. Or he's going to come end him. And there won't be 6 of 'em next time. There'll be enough." Wade looked at her a long moment. "Then we don't wait for it," he said. "No. No, ma'am. A man like Rourke, his whole strength is in nobody knowing what he's really after. Right now there's you, me, and old Tom Whitaker, who know that foal's worth a fortune. 3 people. That's a secret he can bury." Wade's jaw set. But a secret ain't a secret once it's out. Once the whole valley knows what that horse is knows, Rourke offered $300 cash for a stray, knows he dammed a creek and half-starved 5 families to get at one widow's colt. Then killin' Ember don't make his problem go away. It makes it worse. It makes people ask why. He looked at her. "We can't outgun him, ma'am. But we can make it so the one thing he needs quiet is the one thing he can't have." "How?" "Old Tom," Wade said. "He knows every breeder and every buyer between here and St. Louis. He knows how to find out whose bloodline that is. And once we know whose it is—" Wade's eyes were hard and bright now. "We know exactly what Clayton Rourke's so scared of. We know what Ember's evidence of. And a man can't bury a secret that's already riding hard for the county seat in an old German saddlebag." Sarah felt something turn over in her chest. Hope, or the dangerous cousin of it. You think Tom'd do it, ride out, for us. For a widow the whole valley calls mad. Wade almost smiled. "Ma'am," he said, "you didn't see the old man's face at that fence. Tom Whitaker's spent 40 years watching rich men breed magnificent horses and treat 'em like coin. And then he rode out here and found the finest animal he's seen in a decade being kept alive on bitter well water, and a widow's stubbornness hid on 40 dying acres from the very men who'd throw it away." Wade shook his head. "He'll ride. Not for you. Not even for the horse exactly. He'll ride 'cause somewhere out there is a rich man who tried to murder something beautiful to save his own hide, and there is nothing on God's earth Tom Whitaker hates more than that." Matita. But they were a day too slow starting, and Clayton Rourke was a day faster than either of them believed, and that night, the very night they made their plan, Sarah woke in the black hours to embers screaming. Not whickering. Screaming. The high tearing sound of a horse in terror, and under it a sound she knew even from a dead sleep, a sound every ranch wife learns to fear in her bones. Fire. She was out of bed and out the door in her nightdress with the shotgun, before her mind had even caught up to her feet, and Wade was already ahead of her, already running, and the barn. The little barn where they'd penned Ember at night for safety, the barn Sarah's dead husband had raised with his own hands, was burning. "Ember!" Sarah's scream tore out of her. "Wade! He's inside! He's inside! I got him! I got him!" Wade hit the barn door at a dead run and threw it back and vanished into the smoke, and Sarah stood frozen 1 second in the heat and the light of her whole life burning. And then she was moving too, running for the paddock gate, screaming Ember's name into the roar. And out past the reach of the firelight, at the top of the far rise, 3 riders sat their horses and watched the barn burn. She saw them. Just for a second as the flames threw their light up the slope, 3 men still as stones making sure of their work. And then Wade came staggering out of the smoke, half dragging a wild-eyed, screaming, singed, but living foal by a rope around his neck, and Sarah forgot the riders entirely, and threw herself at Ember, and got her arms around his neck, and the 3 of them went down together in the dirt, coughing, gasping alive, while behind them Daniel McAllister's barn folded in on itself in a roar of sparks. When she could breathe, when she could see, Sarah lifted her head and looked back up at the rise. The 3 riders were gone. But Clayton Rourke had answered her, and there was no mistaking a single word of it. He had offered her $300. She had told him to get off her land, and so he had come in the night to burn a fortune to the ground, rather than let a widow keep it, because a dead foal in a burned barn asks no questions and proves nothing, and Clayton Rourke would rather have ashes than answers. Sarah McAllister knelt in the dirt, with her arms around the neck of the horse the whole world had thrown away, and watched the last of her husband's barn burn down to coals, and when she finally spoke, her voice did not shake at all. "Wade," she said, "saddle a horse at first light." "Ma'am, old Tom rides today," Sarah said, and her eyes were reflecting the fire, red and steady as banked coals, red as the glints in Ember's coat, red as something that everyone had been sure was long burned out, and was only now at last catching. "We find out whose blood this is. We find out what Clayton Rourke's so scared of." She stood, one hand still on Ember's trembling neck, and looked up the empty rise where the riders had been. "He just burned my husband's barn to keep a secret. So I'm going to take that secret and I'm going to carry it into the light where the whole valley can see it. And then we'll find out how a man like Clayton Rourke does in the daylight." The barn collapsed the rest of the way behind her. Ember pressed his singed head against her shoulder. And Wade Calloway looked at the widow standing straight-backed in the ruin of everything she had left unbroken, unbowed, lit up like a coal in the dark, and understood that Clayton Rourke had just made his second unforgivable mistake. The first had been deciding a McAllister could be broken. The second was giving her something new to fight for on the very same night he'd shown her at last exactly what she was fighting. Old Tom Whitaker did not ride out that morning after all, because old Tom Whitaker came to them first, and he came at a gallop. Sarah heard the fat gray mare pounding up the track before the sun had cleared the ridge, and she came out of the house, face streaked with ash, eyes hollow from a night of no sleep. Expecting Rourke, expecting more men, expecting the end. What she got was a furious old German, half falling out of the saddle, his white hair wild, pointing back over his shoulder toward the black skeleton of the barn. "I saw the smoke," Tom Whitaker said. "From 2 hours off, I saw it. And I said to myself, Tom, there is only one thing in this valley worth burning, and it is standing in that widow's paddock." He got both feet on the ground and grabbed Sarah by the shoulders hard, his old hands shaking. "Tell me he lives. Tell me the horse lives." "He lives," Sarah said. Wade pulled him out. The old man closed his eyes. His whole body sagged with it, and Sarah understood in that moment that Tom Whitaker had ridden 2 hours at a gallop in the dawn cold, not knowing genuinely, not knowing whether he was riding toward a rescue or a grave. "Gott sei Dank," he breathed. Then his eyes snapped open, and the softness was gone, and what was left was hard as flint. "Where is he? Show me. I must see him with my own eyes, and then, Frau McAllister, you and I are going to talk about the thing I did not sleep for thinking about all night." They walked him to the paddock. Ember stood at the far rail, singed along one flank, jumpy, but alive, and in the flat morning light, somehow more than he'd been the day before, as if the fire had burned some last softness out of him, and left only the hard, bright thing underneath. Tom Whitaker went to the rail and stood there, and looked at him for a long time, and then he did something Sarah didn't expect. He took off his hat. "I did not sleep," the old man said quietly, not turning around, "because of the coat. You understand? 3 weeks I have thought about that coat. Black that throws red in the sun. Do you know how rare that is, woman? In 40 years I have seen it twice. He turned around and his old eyes were fierce. And both times it was the same blood, the same line. A line so fine and so guarded that the men who own it do not sell the foals, they keep them every one, and they write each birth in a book, because each one is worth more than a good man earns in 10 years. He jabbed a finger at Ember. "That is what you have. Not a fine horse. A horse from a line that does not lose foals. That counts every foal. That would know to the day exactly which foal went missing and exactly what it was worth." Wade had come up beside them. "You know the line." "I know of it," Tom corrected. "The Ardsley blood. Out of Kentucky, then Denver. Old money, careful money. And I will tell you something that kept me awake worse than the coat." He looked between them. "The Ardsley stock does not come to a valley like this. It does not come within 200 miles of a valley like this. There is no honest road that puts an Ardsley foal in that creek. None. So how, Frau McAllister? How does the most guarded blood in the West End, up half dead in the mud of 40 poor acres in Montana?" Silence. And then Wade Calloway said slow, like a man setting the last stone in an arch. "It don't. Not unless somebody brought it here. On purpose. To be rid of it where nobody'd ever think to look." "Ja," said old Tom softly. "Now you see it. Now you see what I saw at 3 o'clock this morning staring at the ceiling." He put his hat back on. Somebody with a connection to the Ardsley blood. Somebody who could get his hands on one of those foals carried it hundreds of miles to the most forgotten corner of nowhere, and left it dying where a dead stray raises no questions. That is not a horse thief, my friends. A thief sells. This man did not want to sell. This man wanted it gone. He looked at Sarah. And the only reason a man destroys something worth a fortune is that the fortune is the smaller of two dangers. Today. It was Sarah who said the name. "Rourke's not from here," she said slowly. The others turned to her. "Everybody knows that. He came into the valley maybe 6 years back, bought up the high ground, threw his weight around, acted like he'd always owned it. But he's not valley-born. He came from somewhere." She was staring at Ember now, and her mind was moving faster than it had in months. "He came from somewhere with money he wouldn't say how he got. My Daniel said it once. Said Rourke came in flush and mean and closed-mouthed about where the money came from. And honest money likes to talk about itself, and Rourke never would." She looked up. "What if he came from Denver?" Tom Whitaker went very still. "The Ardsley stables are in Denver," he said quietly. "What if he didn't just come from somewhere with money? Sarah pressed the whole shape of it opening up in front of her now. What if he came running from somewhere, with money that wasn't his? And what if the one thing that could ever prove where he came from, and what he did? The one thing with his name written next to it in some careful man's book was a horse. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Wade said very low, "A stallion out of a guarded line don't go missing without a record. Somebody bred that foal. Somebody was owed for it or somebody paid for it, and Rourke's name is in that story somewhere. And if that foal turns up alive and famous and a man like Tom Whitaker starts asking whose blood it is, Mom, then somebody in Denver," Sarah finished, "comes looking for the man who took an Ardsley foal and vanished. And they find him sitting pretty on the high ground of a little Montana valley calling himself Clayton Rourke." She let out a breath. That's it. That's what he's scared of. Ember's not just worth money. Ember's the loose thread. And Rourke spent 6 years and every dirty trick he's got trying to pull it before it unravels the whole coat. "He tried to lose it," Tom said. "You would not let it stay lost. He tried to buy it back quiet. I said no. He tried to burn it," Wade said grimly, "last night. And that failed too." Sarah's jaw set. "So now there's only one thing left he can do, and we all know what it is. He's going to stop trying to make Ember disappear. He can't. Too many people have seen him now, so he's going to make me disappear instead. The land, the taxes, 58 days left on that county notice, and no water, and no barn, and a whole valley that thinks I'm mad." She looked at the two men. "He doesn't have to kill the horse anymore. He just has to take my land out from under me legal and clean. And when the McAllister place goes to the county in 58 days, guess who'll be standing there with cash in hand to buy it? Horse and all. Nobody'll blink. Poor mad widow lost her land in a drought, and kind Mr. Rourke took it off the county's hands. And Ember goes back in his pocket forever, and nobody ever asks whose blood he is, because a horse a man owns raises no questions." Old Tom Whitaker looked at her with something that had moved well past respect now. "You think," he said slowly, "like a man who has been robbed before and learned from it." "I think like a woman," Sarah said, "who's watched exactly how this valley eats the weak and got real tired of being on the plate." The problem, of course, was proof. They had a story now, a good one, a true one. Sarah felt it in her bones, but a story wasn't a thing you could carry into a courthouse. Rourke had money and men and the county foreman in his pocket. Sarah had a burned barn, a bitter well, and a foal she couldn't prove belonged to anyone. She could stand in the middle of town and shout the whole tale of the Ardsley blood and Denver and the fire, and every soul in the valley would nod and murmur, "See poor things gone all the way, touched now, making up wild stories about her dead horse." "We need the record," Wade said. They were sitting at Sarah's table, the three of them, the plates pushed back the last of the day going gold outside. The book Tom talked about. If the Ardsley people keep a book of every foal, then somewhere in that book is the truth. A foal, its markings, its blood, and next to it, what happened to it. Sold or died or lost. And if it says lost, or if there's a name next to it, Rourke's name, Sarah said, or the name he had before he was Rourke. Either way, it's a paper that says this exact foal, with this exact coat, this exact star, and this exact sock, went from the Ardsley stables to somebody who never accounted for it. And that, Wade tapped the table, that a judge'll look at, that even Rourke's money can't just laugh off. "Denver's 400 miles, Sarah said quietly. "I know. 400 miles, and I've got 58 days, no 57 now, and a man who burned my barn last night and'll try worse the second he figures out we know." She looked at Wade. "You ride to Denver and back, that's the better part of 3 weeks if the weather holds and nothing goes wrong, and something always goes wrong. That leaves me here, alone, with Rourke." "You won't be alone," Wade said. "Tom'll—" "I am an old man," Tom Whitaker cut in, "and I will not pretend otherwise, and Rourke has 6 hands who are not old. No. I have a better thought." He leaned forward. I do not ride to Denver. I write to Denver. I know the Ardsley steward knew him 20 years back, a decent man named Ellery, if he still breathes. I write to him. I describe this foal down to the last hair. And I ask him one question. Did you lose an Ardsley colt black-throwing red star and near sock some months back? And if so, to whom? He sat back. A letter is faster than a man, and a letter cannot be shot off its horse on a lonely road. Wade looked at him. And how does the answer get back to us faster than I could write it? The railhead at Miles City has a telegraph, Tom said. Ellery is a modern man if he lives. I write he wires the answer to Miles City, and Miles City is a day and a half's hard ride, Sarah said. Not 3 weeks, days. Days, Tom agreed. And for the first time since the barn burned, Sarah McAllister felt the ground shift under Clayton Rourke instead of under herself. But Rourke was not sitting still while they made their plans, and the next blow came from a direction Sarah never thought to guard. It came through the church. Reverend Peel rode out 3 days later, a soft, worried man Sarah had known for years, a man who'd buried Daniel and prayed over the grave and meant every word. And he sat his mule in her dooryard and would not come down, and Sarah knew before he opened his mouth that he'd been sent. Sister McAllister, he said, and he couldn't look at her. I've come out of Christian Concern. There's talk, serious talk. The women of the congregation, they're frightened for you, Sarah. Frightened of me, you mean? For you, he insisted weakly. This business with the horse, living out here alone with a strange man, a drifter, no husband, no chaperone, and now the fire and the wild stories you've been, Sarah, folks are saying you've had a break of the mind, from the grief. He wrung the reins. There's talk of writing to the county, about your fitness, to manage your own affairs. The bottom dropped out of Sarah's stomach. My fitness, she said. A woman alone in your state of mind, they only want to help. Who? Sarah's voice had gone flat and dangerous. Who's leading this Christian Concern, Reverend? Which of the good women of the congregation lies awake nights so worried about my fitness that she wants the county to declare me mad and take my affairs out of my hands? She already knew. She watched the answer cross the Reverend's soft, miserable face before he said a word. It's Rourke. He's put one of his people up to it, or he's leaned on somebody who owes him. He can't take my land fast enough with the taxes, so now he's going to have me declared insane, and an insane woman can't hold property, can she? Can't sign a paper, can't refuse an offer. They'd appoint somebody to manage me, and you'll give one guess who'd volunteer. Reverend Peel said nothing, which said everything. You buried my husband, Sarah said quietly. You held my hand at that grave, and you told me God had not forgotten me. And now you ride out here to tell me the man who burned my barn is fixin' to have me locked away, and you call it Christian Concern. She stepped up close to the mule, and the soft old preacher flinched. Look at me, Reverend. Look at my eyes and tell me true. Do I look mad to you? Or do I look like a woman who's finally figured out exactly what's being done to her, and by who? The Reverend looked at her. For a long moment, he really looked the way Tom Whitaker had looked at the horse, seeing past the story he'd been told to the thing that was actually in front of him. No, he said, finally very low, and something like shame moved over his face. No, Sarah. You don't look mad at all. You look clearer than any soul I've spoken to in a month. He swallowed. God help me. I've been carrying a rich man's water and calling it mercy. Then carry mine for a change, Sarah said. Go back to town. And to every good woman who's so frightened for my mind, you tell 'em this. The widow McAllister is of sound mind and clear sight, and she has noticed, Reverend, that every misfortune to fall on her head since she saved a dying foal has come from exactly one direction. You tell 'em to ask themselves why a man who called that horse worthless would pay $300 for it, dam a creek to starve it, burn a barn to kill it, and now wants a widow declared mad to steal it. You tell 'em to ask that question. Her voice rang across the yard. And any woman who can hear that question and still call me the crazy one, well, she's welcome to her opinion. But she'd best examine which of us has actually lost her senses. Reverend Peel looked at her a long moment more. Then he took off his hat, the second man, to bare his head to her in a week, and he said, quiet, "I'll tell them, Sarah. God forgive me for needing to be asked." And he turned his mule and rode back toward town, and he rode slower than he'd come, like a man carrying a heavier load home than the one he'd brought. The turn came 4 days later, and it came at the well. Sarah was hauling the bitter water up bucket by bucket in the punishing heat. The daily labor of keeping her stock and her horse alive with a creek dammed against her, when she heard a wagon on the track, and she reached for the shotgun she now kept always within arm's length, and then she saw who it was, and her hand fell away. It was the Wexlers, the whole family. The father, Amos, thin and gray, his wife, and skinny Ruby, the girl who'd been forbidden to trade eggs. And their wagon was piled with their few belongings, and their stock trailed behind on ropes gaunt and stumbling, and Sarah understood before Amos Wexler said a word that these were people who had come to the end of something. "Miss McAllister." Amos got down, heavy hat in hand. "I'll say it plain, 'cause I ain't got the pride left for anything else. Rourke's dam dried us out same as you. Worse. We're below you, we get what you don't use, and you don't use much." He swallowed. "My stock's dyin'. My children are we got nothin' left, ma'am. And I've been too proud and too scared of the talk to come to the one place in this valley I knew had water, 'cause the whole town says you're mad. And I let myself believe it was easier than admittin' the only decent soul left out here was the widow they all spit on." His voice cracked. "I've come to beg water off you, Miss McAllister. For my animals, for my children, and I got no right to ask it, seein' how I never once spoke up when they slandered you." Sarah McAllister stood there with her hands raw from the rope and her back aching and 50-some days on a debt she couldn't pay, and she looked at this broken, proud man and his silent wife and his skinny, frightened girl, and every hard thing the valley had done to her sat in her chest and told her she'd earned the right to turn them away. She set the bucket down. "Ruby," she said to the girl, "there's a dipper by the well and a trough just past it. You water your family's stock as much as they'll take, and then you fill every vessel you brought." She looked at Amos. "The water's bitter. It won't kill you, and it won't taste like much. There's plenty. Daniel's daddy dug deep." Her voice was even. "You didn't have to beg, Mr. Wexler. You just had to come." Amos Wexler's face crumpled. His wife made a small broken sound and put her hand over her mouth. "After what this valley's said about you," Amos managed. "After all of it, you'd just give it." "I saved a dyin' foal that everybody told me to leave in the mud," Sarah said. "You think I'm going to turn away dyin' children over some talk?" She almost smiled, and it was tired, but it was real. "Water your stock, Amos, and when you get home," she looked at him steady, "you tell the truth about where you got it. That's all I ask. Not gratitude, not friendship. Just the next time somebody in town starts in about the mad McAllister widow, you tell 'em the mad widow gave you water when the sane men dammed it up. You tell 'em who fed your children in the dry year." She picked her bucket back up. "The truth. That's the only payment I want, and it don't cost you a cent." Amos Wexler put his hat back on, and then slowly, deliberately, he took it back off and held it over his heart and said, "I'll tell 'em, Miss McAllister. I'll tell 'em till my throat gives out. And I'll tell you something else, and it ain't much, but it's mine to give." He drew himself up. "There's more'n one family Rourke dried out. There's the Pruitts and the Kesslers and the Doyle boys down the flat, all of us starvin' below that dam and too proud or too scared to come up here. But they'll come now, when I tell 'em there's water and it's free and it's yours." His jaw firmed. "You've been standin' alone up here, ma'am, thinkin' the whole valley's against you. But the whole valley ain't Clayton Rourke. It just sounds like him 'cause he's the loudest and the rest of us been too beat down to talk over him." He looked at her. "That changes today. You gave my Ruby water. I don't forget a thing like that. And neither will they." Chacho. He was as good as his word. The Pruitts came the next morning. The Kesslers that afternoon. The Doyle boys, and then 2 more families Sarah barely knew by name. All of them dried out by Rourke's dam. All of them come at last to the mad widow's free bitter well because it was the only water left below the high ground that a poor man could drink. And Sarah gave it all of it freely to every soul who came, and something began to happen in her dooryard that Clayton Rourke, doing his cold sums up on the high ground, had never once accounted for. The people the valley had beaten down were gathering in one place, and they were talking. "He said your horse was worthless," Old Man Pruitt said, spitting on the third day, then paid 300 for it. 300. "Damned a whole creek and starved 5 families to death over one widow's colt," said Kessler. "And we let him. 'Cause he told us she was crazy, and we wanted to believe him on account of it was easier in admitting we was too yellow to cross him." "He burned her barn," said one of the Doyle boys, low and furious. "Everybody knows it, and nobody said it out loud. Burned Daniel McAllister's barn to the ground with the horse inside, and we all just looked away." And Amos Wexler, standing in the middle of them, with a dipper of Sarah's water in his hand, said the thing that turned it. "I been asking myself something these 3 days drinking this water she didn't have to give. If Clayton Rourke'll do all that damn the creek burn the barn, try to have a widow, declared mad over one horse." He looked around the circle. "Then what in God's name is that horse that a rich man'd risk hanging for it? What's Clayton Rourke so scared of that he'd burn a barn in the night like a common outlaw?" Nobody had an answer. But Sarah did, standing at her well watching the men who'd shunned her 3 weeks past, now stand in her yard, drinking her water, and asking at last the one question she'd been praying somebody besides her would ask. She didn't answer it. Not yet. The letter to Denver hadn't come back. She had a story, and no proof, and a valley half-turned, but not yet turned, and one wrong word could still send them all skittering back to Rourke's version. But she watched them ask it, and she knew that the question once asked out loud in a crowd could not be unasked. Clayton Rourke's whole power had been built on nobody wondering, and now, at her free bitter well, in the mouths of the men he'd starved, the wondering had begun. It was into that gathering on the 5th day that Wade Calloway came riding hard from the direction of Miles City, and Sarah saw his face from 100 yards off and knew. The answer had come. He didn't wait to dismount properly. He half fell off the horse and crossed the yard in 6 strides, and there was a folded paper in his hand, and his eyes were burning. "Tom's letter came back," he said. "Ellery's alive. Ellery remembers." He was breathing hard. "Sarah, the Ardsley steward wired back 3 lines to Miles City, and I've read 'em 40 times on the ride home, and I still can't hardly believe it." He held out the paper, and his hand was not quite steady. There was a colt, black throwing red star near Sock Fold last spring out of the finest mare they had. And it didn't die Sarah, and it wasn't sold. He looked at her. It was stolen. Stolen out of the Ardsley stables in Denver in the night, along with $4,000 from the strongbox by a stable manager who vanished the same night and was never found. His voice dropped. A man they only ever knew by the name he gave. A man named... He didn't have to say it. Sarah felt it land in her chest like the last stone in the arch, and around her the gathered families went silent, every one of them leaning in. "Rourke," Sarah breathed. "The name he gave was Rourke." "The name he gave was Rourke," Wade confirmed. "And Ellery says there's a standing reward. $400 for the man, and the return of the colt. And the colt is the proof, Sarah. The colt is how they'd know him. It's the only thing tying the thief they lost in Denver to the rich man sittin' on the high ground of this valley." He gripped her arm. "That's why he couldn't sell Ember. That's why he couldn't keep him where he'd be seen. That's why he tried to lose him, then buy him, then burn him. Because the second anybody connects that horse to the Ardsley theft, the second Ellery, or a marshal lays eyes on that coat. Clayton Rourke hangs," Sarah finished very quietly, "or goes to prison for the rest of his natural life." And in the sudden ringing silence of her dooryard in front of every dried-out family, Clayton Rourke had starved and slandered and beaten down, Amos Wexler said, in a voice thick with something between wonder and rage. "Then it ain't the widow that's the criminal in this valley. It ain't ever been." He turned in a slow circle, looking at every face. "We've been calling her mad for saving a horse, and all this time she's been the only one keeping the one piece of proof that could put a thief and an arsonist behind bars. We didn't shun a crazy woman, boys." His voice broke. "We shunned the only honest soul left standing because a guilty man told us to." Sarah McAllister stood at her well with the wired paper in her hand, and the whole broken valley gathering itself around her, and for the first time she did not feel like a woman under siege. She felt like the still point that everything else was finally at last beginning to turn around. But she also knew cold and certain the way she'd learned to know things this brutal summer, that a cornered man is never more dangerous than the moment his secret slips his grip. Clayton Rourke had killed nothing and burned everything to keep this exact piece of paper from ever being written. And somewhere on the high ground behind that dam, he was going to learn soon, and from someone, that a drifter had ridden back from Miles City with something folded in his hand, and that the Mad Widow's Well had become the one place in the valley where men gathered to ask the question he could not survive. She looked down at Ember, grown tall and hard and bright at the paddock rail, the living proof of a rich man's ruin, the coal that would not go out no matter how many times the world tried to bury it. "He's gonna come," she said quietly to Wade, to Tom, to the gathered valley. "He knows he's running out of quiet ways. And a man with a rope waiting for him don't fight careful." She folded the paper and pressed it flat against her heart. "He's gonna come for this horse, and this paper, and me, and he's gonna come with everything he's got left, because it's the only move he has that ends with him still breathin' free." She looked up, and the red light of the low sun caught her eyes and made them burn like the coat of the horse beside her. "So, we'd best be ready to meet him, all of us, together, in the daylight where the whole valley can finally see the truth of what's been living up on that high ground all along." They didn't have to wait long, and Clayton Rourke didn't come alone. It was Ruby Wexler who saw them first. The girl had taken to keeping watch from the low rise near the paddock, and she came flying down to the well, screaming, "Riders, Miss McAllister, riders, a whole lot of 'em." And Sarah set down the dipper and straightened and shaded her eyes. And there they came up the track in a slow, ugly column, Rourke out front, and behind him, not 6 men, but a dozen, and behind them worse, a knot of townsfolk on wagons and mules, the respectable men of the valley, the ones who'd nodded along to every lie. "He's brought the whole town," Wade said grimly, coming up beside her, and Sarah heard what he didn't say. Rourke hadn't come to burn or shoot in the night this time. He'd come in broad daylight in front of witnesses, to do the one thing that would end her clean and legal, and leave him looking like the reasonable man. "He's not going to fight us," Sarah said slowly. "Look, he brought the county. He brought Bannister there on the gray. And who's that beside him in the black coat?" "That," said old Tom Whitaker low, "is a judge or a lawyer or a man who wants us to think he is one. Rourke has stopped playing the outlaw Frau McAllister. He is going to play the citizen." The old man's jaw tightened. "This is more dangerous than the fire. A fire you can put out. A crowd that has already decided is very hard to unconvince." The column drew up in a wide arc across Sarah's dooryard, and the dust rolled over the gathered Wexlers and Pruitts and Kesslers, and for a moment the two groups faced each other in the killing heat. The dried-out families at the well on one side, the town and Rourke's hired men on the other, and Sarah felt the whole valley balanced on a knife's edge that ran straight through her yard. Clayton Rourke did not get down. He sat his big horse and looked out over the crowd with the calm of a man who has already counted the votes. "Miss McAllister." His voice carried pitched for everyone. "I've come with the county and with respectable witnesses to put an end to a sad business before it goes any further. There's no call for ugliness. I want that understood by all present." He gestured magnanimous at the townsfolk behind him. "These good people have come out of concern, for you and for the peace of this valley." "You've come to take my land," Sarah said. "I've come," Rourke corrected smoothly, "because the county has a lawful claim, and because there's grave concern about your fitness to manage your affairs, and because, and I say this with sorrow, Sarah, you have gathered a mob of desperate men on your property and been filling their heads with wild, dangerous stories. Stories about me." He shook his head sadly. A woman alone, unbalanced by grief, stirring up half-starved folks against a neighbor. You see how this looks. You see why the county had to come. And here was the thing Sarah had braced for. It was a good move. It was a beautiful move. He'd turned her whole defense inside out, the gathering at her well, the questions, the truth spreading, and made it look like the ravings of a madwoman inciting a mob. Half the town behind him was already nodding. Bannister cleared his throat miserable and unfolded a paper. Miss McAllister, I've the county's moved the tax deadline forward on account of the disturbance, public safety. You've got till end of day tomorrow to pay the $62 or the land's forfeit effective immediate. He wouldn't look at her. And there's a petition for a hearing on your competency, signed by a number of concerned parties. Let me guess who's first on the list, Sarah said. It ain't like that. It's exactly like that. But she said it quiet, because she could see it working, could see the townsfolk shifting, could feel the story tilting back toward Rourke's version. Even now, poor mad thing, look at her cornered and raving, and she knew that if she lost her temper here in front of all of them, she'd hand him everything. So she didn't lose it. She turned instead to the man beside her. Wade, she said clear and calm. Read them the paper.
Gentle lad.
Wade Calloway stepped forward, and he took the folded telegram out of his shirt, and Clayton Rourke's easy, magnanimous face did something almost imperceptible, a tightening around the eyes there and gone that Sarah caught, because she'd been waiting her whole life, it felt like, to catch it. He didn't know what the paper was, but he knew Wade had ridden to Miles City, and a man with Clayton Rourke's particular secret could not hear the words "ridden to Miles City" and read them the paper without the floor tilting a little under him. Folks, Wade said, and his voice was steady, and it carried. My name's Wade Calloway. Some of you know me. I drifted in this spring, and Mr. Rourke there offered me $40 a month to help run this widow off her land, and I turned it down, and I've been on this place ever since. He held up the telegram. This here's a wire. Come back 3 days ago from a man named Ellery in Denver, who's the head steward of the Ardsley Stable's biggest, finest horse operation between the Mississippi and the mountains. I wrote to him Tom Whitaker did about a certain colt, and this is what he wired back. This is nonsense, Rourke said, and his voice was still smooth, but there was an edge under it now. This is exactly the kind of wild story I'm talking about. A drifter and a mad widow and an old German waving paper and, last spring? Wade read over him loud. An Ardsley colt was stolen out of the Denver stables in the night. Black coat that throws red. White star. White near sock. He looked up. Every one of you standing here has seen that horse in this paddock. You know that coat. Ain't another like it in 500 miles. Tom Whitaker'll swear to that, and Tom's forgot more about horses than the rest of this valley'll ever know. A murmur went through the crowd. Heads turned toward the paddock, where Ember stood tall and dark and bright, watching the gathering with his ears pricked. Same night that colt was stole. Wade went on, and his voice dropped, and every soul in the yard leaned in to catch it. $4,000 went missing from the Ardsley strongbox, and the man who took it, the man who vanished that same night and was never once seen again, was the stable manager, a man they knew only by the name he'd given him when he hired on. Wade lowered the paper. He looked straight at Clayton Rourke. The name he gave was Rourke. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sarah had ever heard. It did not break the way she'd hoped. It never does all at once. For one long, terrible moment, nobody moved, and Sarah watched the crowd's faces and saw doubt there. Yes, but also the old, deep unwillingness of decent people to believe that the powerful man they'd been deferring to for 6 years was a thief and an arsonist. It's an easier thing to believe a poor widow's gone mad than to believe you've been bowing to a criminal all along. She saw them wanting even now to disbelieve, and Clayton Rourke saw it too, and he laughed. It was a good laugh. Warm, incredulous, the laugh of a wronged man who can hardly believe what he's hearing. A wire, he said, spreading his hands to the crowd. A wire that this drifter says came from a man none of us has met about a theft none of us can check 400 miles away. And on the strength of that, on the strength of a piece of paper, a saddle tramp pulls out of his shirt. You'd have this valley believe I'm a horse thief." He shook his head, chuckling, appealing to them man to man. "Neighbors, I've lived among you 6 years. I've lent money in hard times. You damned the creek," said Amos Wexler. It came out flat and hard from the middle of the crowd, and Rourke's practiced flow stopped dead. "You damned the creek," Amos said, again stepping forward, hat in his hands, but his eyes level. "And you dried out my family, and the Pruitts, and the Kesslers, and the Doyles. And you let our stock die, and our children go thirsty, in the worst summer any of us ever seen. And when we was dying below your dam, Mr. Rourke, you know who gave us water." He pointed at Sarah. "Her. The mad widow. The one you told us all to shun. She gave us her own well, bitter and free, and never asked a thing, but that we tell the truth about where we got it." His voice shook. "So I'm telling it. That's the truth about her. Now let's hear the truth about you. Why'd a man dam a creek and starve 5 families to get at one widow's horse, a horse you swore up and down was worthless, unless that horse was worth more to you dead and gone than all our lives put together? Amos, you're overwrought." "Answer him," said Old Man Pruitt. "You paid $300, said Kessler, stepping up beside Amos, "for a worthless stray. I heard it. Half of us heard it. $300, and to lift the dam, and to square her taxes for a dead colt not worth waterin'. Explain that to us, Mr. Rourke. Go on. We're all listening." The crowd was shifting now, and it was shifting the right way, and Sarah felt it turn like a tide, finally changing direction. "And her barn," said one of the Doyle boys, low and dangerous. "Somebody burned that woman's barn in the dead of night with the horse inside. Everybody in this valley knows it, and nobody's had the guts to say it. Well, I'll say it. Who burns a barn to kill a worthless horse, Rourke? Who does that unless the horse ain't worthless at all? Unless the horse is the one thing on God's earth that can put a rope around his neck." Clayton Rourke's warm, wronged expression was gone. What sat on his face now was the cold, flat thing Sarah had glimpsed on her porch weeks ago, the real man under the good coat, and he made his last calculation in front of all of them. And Sarah watched him make it. He could not talk his way out. Too many threads all pulling at once the wire. The dam, the $300, the barn, the free water. The story had gotten away from him. So he did the only thing a cornered man of his kind has left. He stopped pretending to be reasonable, and he reached for force. "That's enough." His voice cracked out hard as a whip, now all the warmth burned off. "Bannister, read the forfeit. This land goes to the county today, not tomorrow, on grounds of public disturbance, and I'm standing good for the taxes here and now in front of witnesses, which makes the disposition mine." He turned to his hired men. "And that animal is stolen property that I am recovering on behalf of its lawful owners. Take it." 2 of his men swung down and started for the paddock, and Sarah McAllister stepped between them and the gate. "You take one more step toward that horse," she said quiet, and she had Daniel's shotgun in her hands level, "and you'll answer for it. That colt's not going anywhere but Denver in the company of a United States Marshal to be identified by the men it was stolen from. And if it's the innocent horse you claim, Mr. Rourke, then you got nothing to fear from that. Only a guilty man fears a horse being looked at." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "So which is it? You want that colt taken quiet right now before anybody official can lay eyes on it? Or are you happy to let a marshal ride it back to Denver and let Mr. Ellery say whether it's the stolen Ardsley colt or not?" The 2 hired men stopped, uncertain, looking back at Rourke. And Rourke made the mistake that finished him. "Take the horse now," he snarled, and the whole valley heard it. Heard him order his men to seize the animal before it could be examined. Heard the one command that no innocent man in the history of the world has ever given. If Ember was just a stray, there was nothing to fear in a marshal looking. Only a man who knew exactly what that colt was, and exactly what it would prove, would need it gone before official eyes could rest on it. Amos Wexler moved first. He stepped between the hired men and the gate shoulder to shoulder with Sarah, hat gone, fists up. "You'll go through me." "And me," said Pruitt, stepping up. "And me," said Kessler and the Doyle boys. and then more, the dried-out families closing in around Sarah and the paddock in a wall of gaunt, furious, finally unafraid men, and even a few of the townsfolk who'd come with Rourke, drifting now to the widow's side, because a thing had shifted in the yard that could not shift back, and everybody could feel it. Rourke's hired men stopped cold. A dozen men will not wade into a crowd of 30 over 40 a month, not when the crowd is right and everyone knows it. It was Bannister who broke the miserable county foreman who'd carried Rourke's water for years, who stood there now with the forfeit paper trembling in his hand and the whole valley's eyes on him, and a choice at last that he couldn't dodge. "Mr. Rourke," Bannister said, and his voice shook, but he said it. I can't sign this over to you. Not now. Not with—" He gestured helplessly at the crowd at the horse at the wire still in Wade's hand. "Not with all this hanging over it. If there's a stolen horse, if there's a marshal comin', then the county can't be handin' this woman's land to the very man that I can't Clayton. I'd hang right alongside you if half of this is true, and I ain't going to prison for you. Not for 40 a month and a few favors. No." He folded the paper up with shaking hands and stuffed it in his coat. "There's no forfeit today. There's no forfeit tomorrow. Not till a marshal's looked at that horse and this whole thing's been put before somebody with the authority to sort it. And God help me, I should have said as much a month ago." Something in Clayton Rourke's face came apart. For 6 years he'd owned this valley through exactly two things: money and everyone's belief that he was untouchable, and Sarah watched both of them dissolve in front of him in the space of a single afternoon in her own dusty dooryard, over a horse he'd called worthless. His own foreman had turned. His hired men had frozen. The townsfolk were pulling away from him like he'd caught fire. And the mad widow was still standing shotgun steady, unbroken, with the whole beaten-down valley gathered at her back, like she was the thing they'd all been waiting to stand behind. "You," Rourke said. And he was looking at Sarah now, and all the smoothness was gone, and what was left was pure hate. "You dumb, stubborn, lucky woman. You don't even understand what you've done. You've been sitting here this whole summer holding a hangman's rope and calling it a horse." His voice dropped low and vicious, just for her, though the whole silent yard heard it. "You should have taken the $300. "I know," Sarah said. "You keep saying that. But you never did understand why I didn't, and that's been your whole trouble from the start, Mr. Rourke." She lowered the shotgun a few inches, because she didn't need it anymore, and that was its own kind of statement. "You thought I was holding out for more money, or that I was too mad to know a good offer. You never once considered that a person might just refuse to let a living thing be thrown away, refuse it clean all the way down no matter what it cost her, because it was wrong. That's the one thing men like you can't figure. You can buy a person's need. You just never learned there's some folks whose no isn't for sale." Rourke's hand moved toward his coat. It was small and it was fast, and maybe half the crowd didn't even see it, but Wade Calloway saw it. And Wade had been watching Clayton Rourke's hands the whole time. And Wade's own hand was already there. "Don't," Wade said. Just the one word. But there was a whole life behind it, a whole history of hard country and hard men, and it stopped Clayton Rourke's hand halfway to his coat. "Don't you do it, Rourke. There's 30 witnesses and a wire to Denver, and your own foreman turned on you. You draw that, and even if you get me, you hang for certain in front of everybody today." Wade's voice was almost gentle. "The only road you got left that don't end in a rope is to ride out of this valley right now, quiet before the marshal comes. That's more mercy than you gave a half-dead foal in the mud. I'd take it." For one long, terrible heartbeat, nobody breathed. Rourke's hand hovered. His eyes moved over the crowd, the wall of men, the shotgun banister with the unsigned paper, the horse standing bright and living behind it all, the horse that was going to hang him. And Sarah watched the arithmetic finish behind his eyes. His hand came away from his coat, empty. "This isn't finished," Rourke said. But even he didn't believe it. It came out of him like air out of a punctured thing, and everyone heard the hollowness in it. "It isn't." "It's finished, Clayton," Bannister said quietly. "It's been finished since you told him to take the horse now." Rourke looked at the foreman, then at the crowd, then last at Sarah McAllister, the widow he'd damned and starved and slandered and burned out and tried to have locked away the widow who was still standing, and whatever he saw in her steady face seemed to take the last of it out of him. He gathered his reins. "You'll regret this valley," he said. "All of you." But it was a beaten man's line, and it landed on a crowd that had stopped being afraid of him, and a few of them actually laughed. And that laugh, that small, contemptuous laugh at the man they'd all trembled before an hour ago, was the truest measure of how completely it had turned. Clayton Rourke wheeled his horse and rode out through the parting crowd, and his hired men looked at each other and looked at the wall of witnesses, and one by one they decided that 40 a month didn't cover this, and they peeled off and rode after him in ones and twos. But they didn't ride like an escort. They rode like men putting distance between themselves and something that was about to fall. But he was not gone. Not really. Sarah knew it, even as the dust rose behind him, knew it in her bones. A man like Clayton Rourke with a rope in his future doesn't ride meekly off to wait for the marshal. And she was right, and the proof came before Rourke had even cleared the far rise. Because he stopped up there on the high ground at his dam, and Ruby Wexler, still keeping her watch, screamed it out. "He's at the dam, Miss McAllister. He's doing something at the dam." Wade was already running for his horse. "He's gonna break it," he shouted. "He's gonna break his own dam, all that water pent up all summer. He lets it go at once, it'll come down this draw like a wall." He hit the saddle. "The paddock's in the low ground. Sarah, the horse is in the low ground." The whole yard came apart into motion and terror. Because it was true, Rourke's dam had been holding back a summer's worth of a Mountain Creek acre. Feet of it pooled up behind logs and earth. And if he cut it loose all at once, it would come roaring down the natural draw of the creek bed and the paddock, and the low pens, and everything Sarah had left sat right in its path. He couldn't have the horse, so he would drown it, and her whole place with it, and call it an act of God a dam, giving way in a wet broke summer, a tragedy, nobody's fault. Ember. Sarah was already running, and the families were running with her, scattering toward the low pens, and up on the high ground they could see Rourke's men, a couple of them, at least the loyal ones, swinging axes and levers at the base of the dam, working it loose, and the first dark seep of water beginning to show through. "There's no time to lead him out the gate," Wade yelled, wheeling his horse. "The draw'll be full before we get him up the track. We gotta take him up the ridge, straight up the high side." "He's never been ridden," Tom Whitaker shouted. "That colt has never had a saddle, never had a man on his back. He's barely green broke to a halter." And Sarah McAllister reached the paddock gate and threw it open, and looked at the horse, the half-wild, never-ridden, fire-forged colt she'd breathed life into on a creek bank 3 months ago, and up the draw, she heard the dam let go. It went with a sound like the world tearing. A groan, then a crack, then the deep sucking roar of a summer's worth of held-back water breaking loose all at once and coming down the draw in a brown wall, and there was no more time for saddles or safe plans or anything but the one impossible thing. Ember! Sarah didn't reach for a rope. She reached for his neck, the way she had on the creek bank, the way she had every night by the fire, and she put her face against his, and her voice was the only calm thing in the roaring world. "Baby. Baby. I need you to trust me one more time. Just like the first night. You and me. We go up, and we go now, and we go together. You hear me? You ain't done. You ain't done." And the horse that had never been ridden, the horse the whole world had thrown away, stood still and trembling under the hands of the only human being who had ever refused to let him die and let her swing up onto his bare back. The water was 50 yards up the draw and closing. The families were scrambling for the high ground, Wade driving them ahead of him, Ruby Wexler hauled up behind Amos on a mule, and Sarah McAllister bareback on a wild horse, with both hands full of his mane, and her whole heart in her voice, turned him toward the ridge and the high side and the light, and gave him his head. "Go," she breathed. "Ember, run." And he ran. He ran like the water was already at his heels, because it was. Sarah McAllister lay low over his neck and gave him everything. No rein, no bit, nothing but her hands in his mane, and her voice in his ear, and her whole body trusting a wild thing to carry them both out of the reach of a dying man's last spite. Behind them, the brown wall came roaring down the draw, tearing the paddock rails to splinters, swallowing the low pens whole. And Ember climbed the ridge in great heaving surges, his hooves throwing dirt, his breath like a bellows, and the water clawed up the slope behind them and fell just short. And then they were up on the high ground, and the flood spent itself in the draw below, in a churning brown ruin. Sarah didn't stop him at the crest. She let him run it out along the ridgeline until his terror bled off into hard breathing, and then she brought him down slow with her voice alone, and slid off his back onto shaking legs, and stood there with her forehead pressed to his heaving side, while the whole valley the families weighed. Old Tom came scrambling up behind them, onto the safe high ground. "You did it," Wade said, reaching them first, half falling off his own lathered horse. "God almighty, Sarah, you rode him bareback up that ridge with the water I never in my life." He couldn't finish it. "He did it." Sarah said, both hands flat on Ember's neck, her voice broken with it. "He carried us out. The horse everybody threw away carried us out of the last thing that man could throw at us." She lifted her head and looked back down at the drowned draw at the ruin where her paddock had been. "He tried to drown a fortune rather than let me keep it, right to the end. Right to the very end, he'd rather have had nothing than let the widow have it." And Amos Wexler, coming up gaunt and soaked and furious, looked down at the flood and then up toward the high ground where Rourke had cut his dam, and said the thing they were all thinking. "Where'd he go? A man does that, breaks his own dam to drown a woman and her stock in front of 30 witnesses. He don't stick around to answer for it. He's running." He was running. But Clayton Rourke had made one last miscalculation, and it was the same one he'd been making all summer. He'd counted on the valley staying beaten. Because the flood he'd loosed to drown Sarah's low ground had come down the draw and spread wide across the flat below, and the flat below was the county road. And the county road that very afternoon had a rider on it. Ruby Wexler saw him first again. The girl had a gift for it, pointing down off the ridge with her whole arm. "A rider on the low road, coming up from the south, and he's Miss McAllister. He's got a star." Old Tom Whitaker started to laugh. It began low in his chest and built until the old man had to hold his own knees. "Ellery," he wheezed. "Ellery, you beautiful modern fool. I wired him back after his answer came. I told him what was happening here, told him it was his stolen colt, and his stolen $4,000, and the man who took them sitting fat in a Montana valley. I did not truly think." He wiped his eyes. "I did not think he would send a marshal. But there he is. Ellery sent the law, and the law has ridden 400 miles. And it has arrived on the one afternoon in 6 years that Clayton Rourke has finally publicly in front of the whole valley shown exactly what he is." The marshal came up the flat at a canter drawn by the crowd on the ridge and the wreck of the flood, and behind him, Sarah squinted. Behind him rode a second man, older spare, in a good traveling coat, gone dusty, with 400 miles. "That's no marshal, that second one," Wade said. "No," said Tom softly, and there was wonder in it. "No, that is Ellery himself. He came. The old steward came all this way to see with his own eyes." He shook his head. "To see whether the colt he lost was truly alive." They came up onto the ridge, the marshal and the steward, and the marshal took one look at the drowned draw, and the wrecked paddock, and the 30 soaked and furious witnesses, and the widow standing bareback, flushed beside a horse that threw red in the sun, and he said, "Somebody tell me what in the hell has happened here, and tell me quick." And the valley told him, all of them at once, and then Amos Wexler cutting through to tell it plain: the dam, the starving, the free bidder. Well, the burned barn, the $300 for a worthless stray, the wire from Denver, and this very hour in front of everyone, Clayton Rourke ordering the horse seized before the law could see it, and then cutting his own dam loose to drown it, and the widow both when he couldn't have it. The marshal listened, and his face got harder with every word, and by the end of it, he wasn't looking at Sarah anymore. He was looking off toward the high ground where Rourke had run. But it was Ellery the old steward who got down off his horse and walked slow like a man in a dream toward the paddock rail where Ember stood. The whole ridge went quiet to watch it. Ellery stopped a few feet from the horse. He looked at the coat. the star, the near sock. He looked for a long, long time, and Sarah saw his old hands begin to tremble. And then the steward said in a voice thick with something that had been 400 miles and half a year in the coming midnight's ember. Sarah's breath caught. What? That's his name. His true name written in the Ardsley book the day he was foaled. Ellery reached out, and Ember, who shied from strangers, who'd shied from every soul but Sarah and Wade, stood still, and let the old man lay a hand on his neck. Tears were running plain down the steward's face now. Out of the mare, midnight sovereign by the stallion Ember of the Ridge. The finest cross the Ardsley line ever produced. Worth, ma'am, this colt was insured for more money than most men see in a lifetime, and he was worth every cent of it. And the night he was stolen, the whole stable grieved like we'd lost a child. His voice broke entirely. We thought he was dead. 6 months, we thought some thief had ridden him to death on the trail, or put a bullet in him when he couldn't sell him. We grieved him. He turned and looked at Sarah, and his old face was wet and wondering. And here he stands, grown, sound, magnificent, kept alive by... He looked around at the ruin, the burned barn's black bones, the drowned, draw the gaunt families, kept alive against every earthly thing by a widow on 40 poor acres who never even knew what she had. You didn't just save a horse, Frau McAllister. Tom, is it? You told me she saved him. He shook his head slowly. You resurrected the pride of the Ardsley line. Do you understand what you've done? And Sarah McAllister, who'd been called mad and touched and a fool and a collector of worthless things, who'd been damned and starved and slandered and burned out, stood on the ridge with her hand on midnight's ember and could not for a moment say a single word. Hoik. The marshal caught Rourke before nightfall. He hadn't gotten far. A man who breaks his own dam in a panic and rides off through wrecked country doesn't ride clever, and Rourke's own men had scattered from him the moment the marshal's star appeared on the flat. They found him near the north line of his own. Spread his horse blown himself half out of his mind, and when the marshal named the charges, the theft of the Ardsley colt, the theft of $4,000, and then fresh and witnessed by 30 souls, arson and the attempted murder of Sarah McAllister and her neighbors. By Flood, Clayton Rourke didn't even fight it. Ellery said later, he just seemed to fold like the 6 years of being a big man had been the only thing holding him upright. And the second the truth was out there, was nothing left inside the good coat but a frightened thief who'd finally been caught. They brought him past Sarah's place under guard on the way to the county seat. And the marshal, decent man that he turned out to be, stopped the party at her dooryard and asked her plain, "Ma'am, you've got more right than anybody to look this man in the eye before he goes. You want to—" Sarah came out. Ember was in the near field, and the gathered families were still there. Nobody had wanted to leave that day, and Clayton Rourke sat his horse with his hands bound and his head down and would not look up. She didn't rage at him. She'd thought in the black weeks about all the things she'd say to him if she ever got the chance. Standing here now with his hands tied and his valley turned against him and his whole life come down to nothing, she found she didn't want any of them. "Look up, Mr. Rourke," she said quietly. He looked up. "You told me 3 times to take the $300, Sarah said. You told me I was a fool not to, and I want you to hear this before they take you because I don't reckon you've ever once understood it, and I'd hate for you to go to prison still not knowing." She stepped closer. "You spent your whole life believing that everything has a price, that every person's got a need, and once you find it, you own 'em. You said that to me on my own porch, and you built your whole self on it, the money, the dam, the lies, all of it on. The certainty that there's nothing in this world a man won't sell if you make him hungry enough." Her voice was steady and clear, and it carried to every soul in the yard. "But you were wrong, and the proof of it standin' right there in that field. Because I had nothin', Mr. Rourke, nothin' at all. A dead husband, 40 dying acres of debt I couldn't pay, and a valley that spit on me. You made me as hungry as a person can be made, and I still said no. Not for more money. Not because I was mad. Because some things aren't for sale, and a life is one of them, even the life of a half-dead foal in the mud that everybody but me had already thrown away." She stepped back. You threw him away because you couldn't see what he was. And in the end, that's the only difference between us that ever mattered. I could see. You never could. That's why I'm standing here, and that's why you're leaving in ropes." Day. Clayton Rourke looked at her and looked at the horse, and something in his ruined face finally at long last seemed to understand. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say. The marshal touched his shoulder, and the party moved on, and Clayton Rourke rode out of the valley he'd ruled for 6 years bound and beaten, and not one soul in Sarah McAllister's dooryard said a word until the dust had settled, and he was gone for good. What came after did not come all at once, and it did not come like rain, and that was the whole hard truth of it that Sarah had learned in the fire and the drought. Salvation, when it finally comes, is not weather. It's structure. The Ardsley reward was real $400 for the man, and the return of the colt. But Ellery, when Sarah tried to hand Ember over, closed her hands around the lead rope instead of taking it. "I came to recover a stolen horse," the old steward said, "and I find instead a horse that would be dead a dozen times over if not for you. The Ardsley people are not fools, Frau McAllister, and they are not ingrates. That colt lives because of you, and there is only one place in this world he belongs now, and it is not 400 miles away in a Denver stable he'd have to be dragged back to. It's here, with the woman he'd let ride him bareback through a flood." Ellery smiled. "So here is what I am authorized to offer, and what I would offer besides even if I weren't. The reward money is yours $400 clear, which pays your county debt 6 times over and then some. And the colt is yours deeded and papered free and legal, Ardsley blood and all, on one condition." "Name it," Sarah said. "That you let the Ardsley line come to you." The old man's eyes were bright. "Midnight's Ember is worth a fortune as a horse, but as a sire ma'am bred careful over years on good stock, he is worth a dynasty. The Ardsley people will send you mares, fine mares, and they'll pay for the privilege of the cross and pay again for every foal that carries his blood, and there is not a serious breeder between here and St. Louis who won't beat a path to 40 acres in Montana once word gets round that Midnight's Ember stands at stud here." He spread his hands. "You wanted to survive a summer. I'm offering you something a great deal larger than a summer. I'm offering you the foundation of a bloodline economy right here with you at the center of it. What do you say?" Sarah McAllister looked at the horse, and then she looked at old Tom Whitaker, who knew more about bloodlines than any man alive, and who was already nodding, already grinning his hard old grin. And then she looked at Wade Calloway, who'd turned down $40 a month to help a rich man break her, and stayed instead to help her win. "I say," Sarah answered slowly, "that I've spent this whole summer being told what a woman alone couldn't do. Couldn't run a ranch, couldn't keep her land, couldn't save that horse, couldn't stand against Clayton Rourke." She looked back at Ellery. "So yes, I'll say yes. But not just for me." She turned to the gathered families, the Wexlers, the Pruitts, the Kesslers, the Doyles, all the dried-out folk Rourke had beaten down and she had watered. "There's 5 families in this valley that Rourke starved near to death. 5 families that gathered at my well when they had nowhere else, and stood at my gate when it counted, and didn't run when a rich man told 'em to. Whatever this becomes, the mares, the foals, the money, they've got a stake in it. Grazing shares, full shares, honest work at honest pay. Because I didn't survive this summer alone, and I'm not going to get rich alone either. That's not how a valley ought to work. That's how Rourke worked, and look where it got him. It grew slow. It grew the way Ember had grown, not all at once, but sure and stubborn, and against every reason it shouldn't have. The Ardsley mares came that autumn, 6 of them, the finest horseflesh the valley had ever seen, and old Tom Whitaker moved on to the McAllister place to oversee the breeding, muttering happily in German at the stock, and pretending he wasn't the most content he'd been in 20 years. The bitter well got a windmill and a proper pump, and the reward money paid the county in full, and Eli Bannister, who'd found his spine at the last hour, saw to it personally that the McAllister deed was recorded clean and clear, 40 acres free, and unencumbered in Sarah's own name, Rourke's land forfeit now to the county after his conviction got broken up. And the county, with Bannister pushing hard, and the whole valley behind him, sold it, not to some new big man, but in fair parcels, to the very families Rourke had tried to starve off it. The Wexlers got their water rights back, and then some. The Pruitts and Kesslers and Doyles each got acreage that had been denied them for years. The dam came down for good. The creek ran free through the valley for the first time in 6 years, and even in the dry times after it ran to every place along its length, because Sarah McAllister would not hear of it any other way. By the second spring, the first ember foals hit the ground, long-legged, bright-coated, throwing that impossible red in the sun, and the breeders came just as Ellery had promised from Denver and St. Louis, and further, and left with foals in their strings and a great deal of money in Sarah's account. The 40 acres that had been dying became the beating heart of something the valley had never had, an economy that lifted the low, along with the high, a bloodline that carried a whole community up out of the dust it had nearly died in. And Sarah McAllister, who had come into that brutal summer, a widow the whole valley pitied and shunned, became not a hero exactly. She never would let anyone call her that, but something rarer and more lasting. The one who'd seen what everyone else had thrown away. The one who'd built out of ruin and refusal and a single stubborn no, a valley that finally worked. Go. Wade Calloway never did drift on. He'd meant to maybe once back at the start. A man like Wade wasn't built to stay put. But somewhere in the fire and the flood and the long, slow building after staying had stopped being a thing he had to decide and become simply where he was. He worked the ranch. He gentled the young stock. He and Sarah didn't speak of it for the longest time, the thing that had grown up quiet between them alongside everything else, because they were both people who'd learned to be careful with hope. It was Ellery of all people who forced it on one of his visits out to check the line, the old steward watching Wade cross the yard to take a heavy load out of Sarah's arms without being asked, the way he'd been doing for 2 years, and Ellery saying dry, "That man looks at you the way I've only ever seen a good hand look at a horse he'd walk through fire for Frau McAllister. You might do something about that before you're both too old and stubborn to bother." And Sarah had laughed and blushed like a girl, and that evening at the fence with Ember, grazing in the near field, and the summer wind moving over land that was green. Now actually green, she'd stood beside Wade and said, "You know you don't have to keep pretending you're about to leave. You've been about to leave for 2 years. And Wade had turned his hat slow in his hands the way he did and said, "Reckon I have." "Reckon you're not, though." "No, ma'am." He'd looked at her then, plain and steady, the way he'd looked at the dying foal on the very first day, seeing the thing that was actually there, past what everybody said it was. "Reckon I'm not. Reckon I stopped being a man passin' through the day I carried that foal up to your fire, and it just took me a while to admit it." He'd tipped his hat back. "I ain't got much, Sarah, never did. Wrong sort of man to have much. But whatever I am, and whatever I've got, it's yours if you want it. Has been, I think, since that first mornin'. I just didn't have the words." "You've got words enough," Sarah had said, and reached out and taken his hand. They married in the fall in the Little Valley Church, and Reverend Peel, who'd found his conscience at her dooryard and never lost it again, wept openly through the whole thing. And the church was full packed to the walls with every family the valley had, because there wasn't a soul left who'd have missed it. The women who'd once whispered that she was mad sat in the front pews now and dabbed their eyes. Ruby Wexler, near grown, carried the flowers. Old Tom Whitaker gave the bride away, gruff and proud and threatening in 3 languages, to shoot anyone who made him cry, and crying anyway. And Ember stood in the near field, tall and dark and bright, the ridiculous, miraculous coal that had refused to go out and watch the woman who'd breathed life into him on a creek bank, marry the man who'd carried him from the fire and through his head and ran a wide, bright circle through the green grass of a valley that would never have existed if one widow on one brutal summer morning had listened to the men on the rise and walked away. Years on, when the McAllister-Calloway line was known from the mountains to the Mississippi, and the foals of Midnight's Ember carried families through hard years, all up and down the valley, and Sarah's hair had gone silver, and Wade's beard had gone gray, and the two of them still walked out to the fence every evening, out of a habit they'd never once wanted to break. A young breeder came all the way from Kentucky to buy a foal, and stood at that fence and asked the old woman beside him how it had all started. All of it. The whole famous operation. How did a valley like this, a bloodline like this, ever come to be? Sarah McAllister looked out over the land green now and hers and a whole valley's, and rested her hand on the fence rail beside her husband's, and watched the descendants of one thrown-away foal graze the good grass in the evening light. "A man told me something once a long time back," she said. "Told me everything in this world has a price. Told me every person's got a need, and if you find it, you own 'em." She smiled, and it was an old smile now, and a settled one, and it had a whole hard-won life behind it. He believed that right up until the day it hanged him. And the thing he never understood, the thing that beat him in the end, was standing right in front of him the whole time half dead in the mud, and he called it worthless and rode on by. The young man waited. They threw him away because they couldn't see what he was. Sarah McAllister said, and her voice did not waver, and it never would again. "But I could. That was all. That was the whole of it from the first morning to the last. The whole world looked at a dying thing in the dirt and saw nothing worth saving, and I looked at the same thing and refused to walk away. And everything I have, and everything this valley became, and every good year that ever came after the worst summer of my life grew straight up out of that one refusal." She turned and looked the young man full in the face, silver-haired and clear-eyed and utterly certain. "So you remember this, and you carry it home with you to Kentucky, and you tell it to anyone who'll listen. The most valuable things in this life are almost never the ones the world tells you to want. They're the ones the world throws away and hands without ever knowing it to whoever's brave enough to bend down in the mud and see.